The smell reached the building before the screams did. It was the winter of 1957, and Algiers breathed differently after dark. Jasmine still climbed the stone walls of the Kasbah, that ancient Ottoman quarter where the streets folded into each other like the pages of a book no one had bothered to translate. The minarets still caught the last bruised light of the evening in the same way they had for centuries. But something else moved through those narrow corridors once the city pretended to sleep. Something that had no entry in any public ledger, no column in any official dispatch, no name that any general was willing to sign beneath. A single electrical cable coiled on a concrete floor, thin as a finger, patient as bureaucracy. That image survived, not in photographs, not in military communiques sent back to Paris, but in the memory of those who walked past a particular building on the Rue de la Bombe and heard sounds they spent the rest of their lives trying to unhear. Before morning came, before the city reassembled its performance of normalcy, this story had already been written. In flesh, in silence, in the deliberate, careful omissions of men who believed, with complete sincerity, that they were saving civilization. If you find yourself drawn to histories that institutions tried to erase before the ink had dried, stories buried not by accident but by design, consider subscribing. There is much more of this to come. In a few minutes, you will understand why this story was buried for 50 years, and what it means that it was. Now, let us go back to the beginning. Algeria, 1954. The country had been French for 124 years. That sentence sounds like a historical footnote. It was, in fact, the entire architecture of a catastrophe. Algeria was not a colony in the legal vocabulary of Paris. It was a department. 3 departments to be precise: Algiers, Oran, Constantine. As French in the eyes of the Republic, as Provence or the Loire Valley. The Mediterranean was not a border between two worlds. It was a river the French had decided to cross, and then refused, for more than a century, to uncross. More than 1 million Europeans lived in Algeria by the mid-20th century. They called themselves pieds noirs, black feet, a name whose origins remain disputed, though its weight never was. These were not colonizers in the classic imperial sense, men with pith helmets and temporary ambitions. Many had been born in Algeria. Their parents had been born in Algeria. Some of their grandparents had arrived before the American Civil War. They spoke French, ate French food, voted in French elections, and were, in every category the Republic recognized, French citizens. The 9 million Algerians of Arab and Berber descent were something else entirely. They were subjects, governed by a separate legal code, the Code de l'Indigénat, constructed layer by patient layer over more than a century of occupation. Under this code, they could be imprisoned without trial, fined for offenses that did not apply to European settlers, relocated without consent, surveilled without cause, and conscripted without choice. They could not, in any meaningful sense that democracy requires, vote. They could not hold the same jobs, live in the same neighborhoods, or bury their dead in the same ground as people who had arrived a century after them and declared the land available. The word available carried enormous ideological freight. French colonial doctrine required the land to have been essentially empty before France arrived, or inhabited by people so primitive that their claim to it did not qualify as a claim at all. Generations of French writers, scholars, administrators, and politicians built elaborate intellectual scaffolding to support this belief. The scaffolding required constant maintenance because the land had never been empty and the people had never stopped knowing it was theirs. By late 1954, the scaffolding was showing its seams. On the night of October 31st, 1954, as All Saints' Day approached, as French families across Algeria prepared for a holiday that had nothing to do with the country beneath their feet, small groups of men gathered in apartments, in cellars, in the backs of shops that had already shuttered for the night. They had a name, the Front de Libération Nationale, the FLN. They had a declaration, written in Arabic and French, stating that the Algerian people existed, that their suffering was real, and that they intended to end it. At midnight, they began 70 coordinated attacks across the country, police stations, military outposts, a warehouse in Batna, a barracks in Biskra, radio transmitters. The attacks were not uniformly successful. Several failed, some were intercepted, because the men who carried them out were not professional soldiers. They were mechanics, students, farm workers, and school teachers who had concluded, after years of waiting for change that did not come, that the only remaining language was the one that could not be ignored. The French government called it a bandit uprising. The interior minister of the time, a man named François Mitterrand, who would eventually serve as president of a very different France, stated publicly that Algeria was France and that the only conceivable response was force. He was not wrong that force was coming. He was wrong about almost everything else. The French military arrived in Algeria with something more dangerous than anger. They arrived with a doctrine. That word, doctrine, is the one that changes everything in this story. Not improvisation, not the panicked overreaction of an army that did not understand its enemy. A philosophy, a system. Developed in the wreckage of French defeat in Indochina, refined through the humiliation of Dien Bien Phu, articulated by men who had spent years asking the same question. Why do modern armies lose to insurgencies, and what can be done about it? The key theorist was a colonel named Roger Trinquier, though he was far from alone. The argument, stripped to its operational core, was this: a guerrilla movement survives because it lives inside a civilian population. The population is the water. The fighters are the fish. You cannot kill the fish by attacking the fish. You must drain the water. You must separate fighter from civilian, sympathizer from neutral, network from neighborhood. And the only reliable way to achieve this separation, in the view of men who thought in systems, was information. Specifically, the extraction of information by whatever means the situation demanded. The word torture appears almost nowhere in the official military correspondence of this period. The documents use other language: intensive interrogation, special methods, accelerated questioning, exceptional measures applied under operational necessity. The vocabulary was chosen with care by men who understood that what they were authorizing would one day be read, and who intended to ensure that what was read would not be what was done. What was done was something else. In January 1957, the French government transferred control of Algiers to the 10th Parachute Division, commanded by General Jacques Massu. The city had been shaken by a campaign of urban bombings carried out by the FLN, bombs in cafes, in markets, at a football stadium, and the dead were European settlers, which meant the dead were visible in the French press, which meant the pressure on the government to act was immediate and total. Massu acted. His paratroopers moved into the Kasbah and began what military historians would later call the Battle of Algiers. That name lends it a dignity it does not deserve. What it was, in practice, was the systematic seizure, interrogation, and in many cases, permanent disappearance of the population of an entire city. The operation ran on a system, not chaos, a system. Neighborhoods were divided into sectors, sectors into blocks, blocks into buildings, buildings into families. Every resident was required to register. Every family was assigned an identifier. Block wardens, Algerians cooperating with French authority for reasons ranging from genuine collaboration to bare survival, reported anomalies. An unfamiliar face, an unexplained absence, a room that was always locked, a man who came home at inconsistent hours. The anomalies were investigated. Investigation meant arrest. Arrest meant a particular room in a particular building where a particular set of procedures was applied. The procedures involved electricity, water, the sustained application of physical suffering until a person produced information, or until the questioners concluded that the person had none to give, or until they concluded the person would never speak regardless of what was done, which led to a different kind of conclusion. The official records rarely describe what took place in those rooms. What survives is the space between entries. A man is arrested on a Tuesday. There is no further record. The ledger moves on to the next name. The official word for those who never returned was disparu, disappeared, a passive construction, carefully chosen. In passive grammar, there is no subject. No one disappeared them. They simply ceased to appear. The language was performing what language can always be made to perform: evacuating agency, dissolving responsibility, converting a human decision into a grammatical event with no author. And yet, the system worked. That is the fact that makes this history most difficult to hold without dropping it. By the summer of 1957, the FLN's urban network in Algiers had been largely dismantled. The bombings stopped. Cell leaders had been captured, killed, or fled. Sadi Yassef, the senior FLN commander in the city, was arrested in September. His deputy, Ali Lapont, died when the building concealing him was destroyed by a shaped charge. By the only metric the French military chose to apply, the battle was won. General Massu said years later, decades later, long after the war had ended and France had spent a generation carefully not discussing what had happened in it, that he believed the torture had been necessary, that without it, the city would have been lost, that he would do it again. He said this plainly in interviews, without visible remorse, the way a man describes a difficult professional decision he has fully made peace with. What he did not say, because it would not have occurred to him to say it, was that the decision had not been his alone. The decision had been institutional, structural, procedural. It had been transmitted through a chain of command, authorized at levels above him, and embedded in a doctrine years in development. The men who applied the procedures were not, for the most part, sadists or deviants. Several had been French resistance fighters themselves during the German occupation, which meant they had personal memories of being on the receiving end of exactly this kind of questioning. They applied the procedures because the procedures had been authorized, because the doctrine explained the necessity, because the system had been designed so that the men doing the work did not need to think of themselves as doing anything other than their duty. This is what historians call institutionalization. The violence was not the product of individual pathology. It was the product of authorization, of procedure, of a structure in which ordinary men with families and faith and career ambitions, could commit extraordinary harm without ever experiencing themselves as doing so. That is the moment in this story where the nature of the thing fully reveals itself. This was not a war that had gone wrong. It was a system working exactly as designed. Across the rest of Algeria, the war took a different shape. The ALN, the FLN's military wing, operated in the mountains and the southern desert, in the Jebel, where French troops pursued them with a brutality the cities rarely witnessed directly. Villages suspected of sheltering fighters were sometimes burned. Entire populations were relocated. The official term in French military planning was regroupement, resettlement, and it was conducted with the same systematic efficiency that characterized operations in Algiers. By some estimates, more than 2 million Algerians were moved into regroupement camps over the course of the war. Their agricultural land was left behind, their livestock abandoned. Communities that had existed in those valleys and hillsides for generations were, in the clean language of military planning, cleared. Surviving correspondence from inside those camps, written in Arabic, sometimes smuggled out, sometimes intercepted and translated and filed in archives that were then sealed for decades, suggests a hunger the official records do not acknowledge. Children who had stopped growing, women whose bodies had shut down under sustained stress and malnutrition, men who had simply stopped speaking. The silence in those letters is a particular kind of silence. It is not the silence of people with nothing to say. It is the silence of people who have run out of faith that saying anything will matter, and who are writing anyway, because not writing feels like surrendering the last thing they have left. Meanwhile, the French military was constructing something else, something that would outlast the war, cross borders and oceans, and reappear in fully recognizable form in conflicts that had nothing to do with Algeria, except that they were taught by the same men, using the same manuals, in the same seminar rooms. The strategy was called guerre révolutionnaire, revolutionary war. A war fought not for territory, but for populations, for allegiance, for the invisible geography of loyalty and fear that determines, in the end, who survives an insurgency and who does not. In English, it would eventually be compressed into a single, cleaner word: counterinsurgency. The French army developed dedicated psychological operations units, the 5th Bureau, that deployed alongside the combat troops. Pamphlets, radio broadcasts, village assemblies designed to present France as the protector of the Algerian people and the FLN as a criminal organization with no legitimate cause. These were delivered simultaneously with the special methods. The pamphlet and the electrical cable were not contradictions. They were components of the same architecture, running in parallel, calibrated to the same objective: control of what a population believed and what it was willing to say out loud. Several French officers, not opposed to the war itself, but unwilling to participate in this particular version of it, resigned their commissions in protest. One of them, a young Catholic military chaplain named Jean Muller, was killed before he could complete the testimony he had been preparing. The testimony survived him. It was submitted to a parliamentary inquiry that was then classified for decades. The record of who saw what and chose silence is also a kind of document. Inside the courtrooms, the system was defending itself by other means. There was a lawyer named Jacques Vergès, born in Algeria, educated in Paris, who took on the defense of FLN members brought before French military tribunals. The tribunals were not ordinary courts. They operated under military jurisdiction, with procedural rules quietly adjusted to accommodate the emergency. Confessions obtained during interrogation were admissible as evidence. The methods used to obtain those confessions were not examined. Vergès argued, in hearing after hearing, that a state which tortured its prisoners forfeited its right to call itself a democracy governed by law, and that every confession produced in those rooms was therefore worthless as evidence and monstrous as precedent. The tribunals rejected the argument. The courts of appeal rejected it. Multiple administrations maintained that what was happening in Algeria was a police operation, a public order matter, a counter-terrorism effort, and that the legal frameworks applicable to war simply did not apply. The language is familiar. It always is. By 1958, the war had consumed the Fourth Republic itself, a political crisis, triggered by fears among the Pieds Noirs and the officer corps that Paris might negotiate with the FLN, brought Charles de Gaulle back from retirement. De Gaulle, the architect of French resistance, the general who had refused surrender, the man whose name had become synonymous with the idea of France's unbreakable will. He returned to power with the enthusiastic support of the military commanders who were fighting the Algerian War. They believed he was one of them. They believed he would hold the line. De Gaulle watched. He read the assessments. He reviewed what the military had built. the interrogation centers, the regroupement camps, the psychological operations units, the doctrine in its full elaboration. And he concluded, by a process of reasoning he shared with almost no one, that the war could not be won in any sense that actually mattered, that France could pacify Algeria militarily and still lose it to history, that the world had shifted in ways the men fighting in the Jebel had not yet absorbed, that colonialism, as a sustainable enterprise, was finished. He spent 4 years arriving at this conclusion publicly, in careful stages, each stage generating new crises, new assassination attempts, new fury from officers who felt the general they had restored had become the one they needed to remove. In April 1961, 4 generals launched a putsch from Algiers. They held the military in Algeria. They had paratroopers, airfields, and armor. For 4 days, the French government did not know with certainty whether its own army would march on Paris. The putsch collapsed when the conscript soldiers refused to follow. De Gaulle went on the radio, and something in the country listened. The generals had assumed that rank translated to authority, and authority translated to obedience. They had not prepared for the possibility that the men holding weapons might not consent to be instruments. That was a lesson the doctrine had never thought to include. The war ended in 1962, 8 years after it had begun. The Évian Accords, signed in March, granted Algeria its independence. The Pieds Noirs left. 1 million people in the space of a single summer, abandoning what their families had built over a century. They carried what could be carried. Behind them they left furniture and graves, and the particular hollow silence of homes that had been emptied without ceremony and without farewell. The Algerians who had fought alongside the French, the Harkis, approximately 150,000 men recruited from the Muslim population to serve in French auxiliary forces, were left behind with something that had no name in the Évian Accords. The French government issued instructions that the Harkis were not to be evacuated. The decision was made at the ministerial level. The reasoning, in the cables and memoranda that survive, was political. The new Algerian government would not tolerate the mass extraction of men it considered traitors, and France chose not to press the confrontation. The consequences of that calculation were not political abstractions. In the months following independence, Harkis were killed by the thousands. Some estimates place the number at 60,000 dead. The figure remains disputed, in part because the French government, for decades, found it easier not to know. The relevant documents were classified. When they were eventually opened, what they showed was not miscommunication or a failure of coordination. What they showed was a deliberate decision made by people who understood precisely what they were choosing. The file was closed. The war was over. The army came home. The doctrine traveled with it. The officers who had designed and field-tested the system in Algeria did not return to France and do nothing with what they had learned. Many of them went to the United States. They lectured at Fort Bragg and Fort Leavenworth through the late 1950s and into the 1960s. They explained, in careful professional language, to American officers who were paying very close attention, the techniques that had dismantled the FLN network in Algiers. The curriculum was absorbed. The doctrine crossed the Atlantic and found new theaters. It also traveled south. French officers with Algerian experience trained members of the Argentine military through the 1960s and into the 1970s. Those officers returned home and built their own version of the apparatus. Clandestine detention centers, systematic interrogation, ledgers in which names appeared once and then did not appear again. Between 1976 and 1983, some estimates suggest as many as 30,000 people vanished in Argentina under a military junta that had studied, among other things, what France had built in the Kasbah. The word the regime used for those it had taken was desaparecidos, disappeared, a passive construction, no subject, no author. No one disappeared them. The passive grammar had crossed borders too. Paul Osseresis died in 2013 at 95. He spent the last decade of his life giving interviews to anyone who asked. He said what he had done was necessary. He said he had no regrets. He said his critics were people who had never faced the real choice, information or lives, that he had faced in those rooms. He was not prosecuted for what the rooms had contained. His memoir was briefly banned in France on grounds of glorifying war crimes, but the ban was overturned and the book remained in circulation. He received a military funeral with full honors. The archive he left behind is both a confession and a monument to its own impunity. It tells you, in the first-person voice of a man who was present, exactly what was done in those buildings, and precisely how the authorization flowed downward through the chain of command. And it asks nothing of you in return. No acknowledgement, no reckoning. The testimony of a man who believed, to his last breath, that the system was right, and that the discomfort of those who disagreed was not a moral position, but a failure of nerve. The silence of the disappeared is a different kind of silence. It is not the silence of a position held. It is the silence of an absence that was made, deliberately, in a room, by men who are no longer alive to be asked about it. In the cemeteries outside Algiers, there are rows of graves with no names. The French military buried some of the war's dead in unmarked common pits, without documentation, without any entry in any accessible record. Archaeologists working at several sites through the 1990s and 2000s found remains that could not be identified. Bones with no corresponding file, no ledger entry, no surviving family member who knew to come looking, because no family had ever been told where to look. Other traces survive in a different form. In the walls of buildings in the former Kasbah, researchers found marks scratched into the plaster, lines arranged in groups, the remnants of a counting system that someone had built to track days in a room with no window and no calendar. The marks do not appear in the building's official records, which classify it as a storage facility during the relevant period. The gap between what the records say and what the walls preserved is, in formal terms, a minor administrative discrepancy. It is also the entire story, told in miniature. Files related to Algerian military operations between 1954 and 1962 remain classified in the archives of the French Defense Ministry. The classification is renewable. It has been renewed. The official grounds are operational security and protection of third parties. The third parties, in almost every identified case, have been dead for decades. In 2018, French President Emmanuel Macron acknowledged, for the first time at the level of a sitting head of state, that the French military had used torture systematically during the Algerian War, and that this had been institutional policy rather than individual aberration. He made this acknowledgement through the specific case of Maurice Audin, a young French mathematician living and working in Algeria, arrested by paratroopers in June 1957 and never seen again. For 60 years, the official French position had been that Audin had escaped from custody. The file, when Macron ordered it opened, showed that he had not escaped. He had died during interrogation. The word escaped had been placed in the record by someone who knew it was false. Someone had sat down at a military desk in 1957 and written a deliberate lie into a document they understood would become the permanent record. That is not an aberration in the system. That is the system completing one of its functions. The doctrine developed in Algeria, the classification of civilian populations by loyalty and risk, the extraction of information through physical coercion, the management of insurgency through the management of human beings, did not expire with the ceasefire. It was transcribed into training manuals. It was delivered in seminars. It traveled in the institutional memory of armies that had been taught by men who had used it, and in the professional culture of intelligence services that admired its operational results without subjecting its methods to sustained examination. It is present today, in structures and frameworks and legal justifications on every continent that has experienced what is currently called counterterrorism. The wire on the concrete floor of the building on the Rue de la Bombe has been gone for more than 60 years. The jasmine still climbs the walls of the Casbah. The minarets still hold the evening light in the same way they always have. The question the archive does not answer, the question it was specifically designed to prevent from being answerable, is not whether this happened. It is whether the phrases currently in use, enhanced interrogation, administrative detention, intelligence-driven operations against non-state actors, represent a meaningful departure from the language chosen with deliberate care by men in 1957 who understood that what they were authorizing would eventually be read. The files are still being renewed. The blank spaces are still being maintained by someone, somewhere, making a decision about what the record will say. The question is not only what was written then, the question is what is being written now, and what the person writing it knows they are choosing not to say.